Are you watering your Agave Utahensis incorrectly? Is that even possible? Or do you know what the right amount of water is in your situation with your lighting, with your airflow, with your temperatures, how much water you're giving it every time you're watering? And are you really sure that it's drying out in between each watering? So that's what we're going to talk about today. The right way to water your Agave Utahensis and to make sure it dries out in between each watering and to give it the perfect amount of water to make it look as good as it possibly can. So I've made other plant care videos before, including one where I kind of go over all the basics of plant care for Agave Utahensis in general. But I think there's one aspect in particular that's really important to understand and to nail correctly if you want to make your Agave Utahensis look as amazing as it possibly can. Now, if you just want to make it thrive and survive, you probably don't need to go to all the lengths that I'm about to talk about. But if you're really interested in getting the most out of your Agave Utahensis, this is what I recommend doing. And this is basically the process that I use for the plants that I grow, for the seed grown plants that I grow and sell on my website. So the first thing to understand is that while Agave Utahensis is a xeric plant, it grows in the desert, it grows up in sky islands. That is, it grows up above 4,000, 5,000 feet in the mountains where there is often regular snowpack, so that there's a decent amount of moisture throughout the year. And it can handle quite a bit of water, much more water, I think, than a lot of other plants, particularly cactuses, which a lot of folks will tend to group Agave Utahensis in with, but it can take a lot more water. And in fact, there's been, and I've talked about this before on the channel, but there's been studies done on other forms of agave that show that increased irrigation, increased water does actually speed up growth rates. Now, with cactuses, what a lot of people are afraid of, and with some succulents and plants like agave, what a lot of collectors and growers are afraid of is that if you quote unquote overwater the plant, then you're going to cause it to have some kind of undesirable form. And in fact, a lot of folks will talk about hard growing plants as providing them minimal amounts of water, maybe only when it rains, putting them right in direct sunlight, or just sort of acclimating them as close to direct sunlight as you possibly can, maybe watering them once a week, once every 2 weeks, something like that. And that's fine. If that's your philosophy, that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I have found that it is possible to push your Agave Utahensis with lots and lots of water without having any negative impacts on the way the plants look. In fact, most of my plants have super cool spines. The ones that I've pushed and sort of babied and grow indoors, as opposed to the ones that I quote hard grow outside, have way cooler spine shapes, have way longer spines and teeth, terminal spines and teeth, and have super cool blue coloration. So I don't think there's anything negative about the form. You're not going to make your Agave Utahensis look bad by watering it more than what hard growing would indicate. And in fact, you can make your Agave Utahensis grow faster, and I think better, by giving it as much water as possible. So that's the question. What exactly does as much water as possible mean? Now, we don't want Agave Utahensis to rot. We don't want our agave plants to rot, so we don't really want them sitting in standing water. We don't want the soil to be moist and damp 24 hours a day. First you're going to start to see the soil will get a sort of green covering, and that's algae, and it's mostly fairly harmless, although really thick layers of algae could interfere with nutrient absorption and with water absorption into the soil. So that's probably something you want to avoid for the most part. But if you really have your agave soil, the soil that your agave is sitting in, super wet and super damp, super moist, 24 hours a day, it probably will rot, much like a cactus. Now, cactus, of course, are a lot more sensitive to this sort of thing. And so, again, that's why I say when folks are lumping Agave Utahensis in with cactus, they may get the wrong idea about watering. So the key here, what as much water as possible really means, is that if we're ensuring the plant dries out, the soil that the plant is sitting in dries out completely in between each watering, that's as much water as possible, right? If we can give it as much water as we can while still ensuring that it's drying out before adding new water to it, that to me, and through what I've seen growing a bunch of seed grown plants, is the best way to do that. But then the question becomes, how do we ensure that the plant is fully drying out in between waterings? If you get really good and really experienced at this and you kind of understand your pots and your soil mix and your plants, you can sort of just lift it up and feel, okay, that feels light, it's probably dry, so I need to water it. You can touch the top of the soil, but I've definitely found that, even in pots as small as this, these are 2.75 inch pots, that the bottom of the soil can stay moist and damp while the top of the soil is fairly dry looking. So just touching on the top of the soil isn't the best test. The best way that I've found to understand how often I can water my Agave Utahensis is actually to weigh it, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate here today. So to start with, basically all you need is a little kitchen scale. I have this cheapo one I bought on Amazon. I got my my watering bottle here, and then I've got 2 Agave Utahensis plants. You really would only be doing this with 1, but for the magic of YouTube, I'm going to demonstrate this process with 2, and then something to record your measurements with. I'm using pen and paper here, but I'm a huge nerd. So in reality, what I do is I record my weights here and then put them into the laptop, into Excel, and we'll graph a pattern over time. But we'll talk about that a little more in a second. So the first thing to do is, you turn on your scale, you wait till it says 0 grams. You have to hit the tare button maybe, and then you put your Agave Utahensis on the top of it. And now this one says it's 130 grams, 0.84. The 0.84 is probably a bit too much precision. We don't really need to get to that. It says 130 grams, or you can round up to 131 grams. So I'm gonna mark down the time. Let's say it's 10 a.m. right now, mark down the date. It's 9 today, something like that. And then we're gonna mark down the, at that time, this plant was 130 grams before watering it. I haven't watered it. It's been unwatered since essentially, the last time I watered it. And then I'm gonna take the water. If you don't wanna get water all over your scale, you can take it off the scale, turn your scale off. But then I'm gonna water. And I like to water these pretty good, particularly when you're first starting to do this measurement. You can water pretty good, maybe until there's a little bit of water coming out of the bottom of the pot. You may not need to go that far. And then after time, as you start to build up a pattern of this, and I'll discuss that in a second, what I like to do is when I'm using a water bottle like this, or whatever watering mechanism I use, is I'll actually do a count in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. So you can see now there's water coming out of the bottom of this pot. So this is a thoroughly watered plant. So once I've got it thoroughly watered, I'll turn my scale back on, wait till it shows 0, hit the tare button if I have to, put the plant back on the scale, and now it says that it weighs 151 grams. So basically in that watering, I added about 21 grams of water, right? And so now I know that if I did a count, say I did 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi up to 10 seconds, that with this watering can, a 10 count is 21 grams. And I wouldn't worry too much about getting the 1 Mississippis, or however you do it, 1/1000, to mean exactly a second. All that matters is that it's consistent over time, that your 1 Mississippi is the same one day as it is the next day. Okay, so this, I added 21 grams approximately of water, so then I'll mark that down, that before watering it was 130 grams, and then after watering it was 151 grams, okay? So that part's all super easy. So now what I would do generally is I would take this, put it wherever it is under lights. Again, I grow almost all of my Agave Utahensis indoors under high-powered LED lighting. I also use a ton of fans. So put your plant back to the location that it's gonna live normally, be that in a greenhouse, or be that in somewhere inside your house, where the airflow and the heating situation, the air conditioning situation, and the lighting situation is the same, is what it will normally be. And then after a period of time, if you're a big nerd, you can do this hour by hour for the next day or two, but really, you're probably not gonna end up watering it at most more than once a day, once every 2 days. So then we come back a day later and we take the same plant. Now this is a different plant, obviously, because we're doing this for the magic of YouTube, but so we take that same plant, turn my scale on, wait till it says 0, and put it back on the scale, and magically, it says 130 grams again. So I know, and I say, okay, now it's 10 a.m. again for the magic of YouTube. It was 10 a.m. 5:10, so the next day, and now it weighs 130 grams again. So now I know that the time between those two measurements, those two weigh-ins, about 21 grams of water has evaporated. So that means that if I'm giving it, say that was a day or 2 days, I know that if I'm giving it 21 grams of water every day or every 2 days, that means that it's completely drying out in between those waterings, right? It's getting back to that original dry measurement. And so that's the ideal amount of water to give it on that time schedule, on that time frame. Now, what you're gonna need to do, now I have done this a bunch. I've spent months and months and months doing this with a whole lot of plants. So I kind of know, I've built up a pattern, and I'll show some of the graphs that I've done. Like I said, I've taken these measurements, put them into an Excel spreadsheet. You don't have to get quite so nerdy. You can just kind of eyeball the math here. But if you do this for a couple days, a week, a couple of weeks, if you're super, again, nerdy like me, and you do it for maybe for a couple of months even, with a whole bunch of plants, you'll start to understand a pattern. And you say, okay, one day it was a little bit hotter, so it evaporated 23 grams. One day it was a little cooler, maybe the wind wasn't blowing as hard, so it only evaporated 19 grams. But if you do that over a period of some time, a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, you'll start to see a pattern, and you'll be able to understand how often generally you can water your plants. And you don't have to keep doing this. Now, this is not to say that you need to water your plants and make sure that they're at the dry rate every time you water them, because after a little while, you're going to be able to understand how long it takes to evaporate how much water you're putting in, which is why it's important to do the count, right? The 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, because that's going to tell you how long you're putting the water. And so that way you don't have to measure out, you're not using graduated cylinders or all that to measure out water. You can just count and say, okay, one of my 5 counts out of this bottle produces 20 grams of water, and I know that 20 grams of water evaporates over the course of 2 days in my setup. So that means every 2 days I can give it a 5 count of water, or whatever the numbers are. I think you kind of get the math. It's not really rocket science here, but that's the amount of water you can add to it. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. How do you water your Agave Utahensis? Are you watering it through a system like this? Are you, hard growing it? Are you giving it a lot less water? Are you giving your plants more water? How do you check to see if your plants are fully dry? I'm always really interested to hear folks' different tips and tricks to figure out if their plants are fully dry yet. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments, and thanks for watching.